Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to take part in another BookTuber tag. I'm just having such a great time with these tags. I am feeling so welcome, so much a part of the BookTube community. I just love that sense of belonging. Oh, the poetic bliss and wonder. Today, I would like to take part in a tag called the Phenomenal Woman BookTube tag. This was a tag that was created by Marilyn Maya Mendoza in celebration of her 4th anniversary on BookTube. And I was tagged to take part in this by the wonderful Pat at Book Chat with Pat. And Marilyn and Pat are both certainly phenomenal women. They are both so warm, open and welcoming. Oh, they've made a very awkward person very full of delight and happiness. I am just so wonderful with joy. This is terrific. So let's get straight down to this tag, the Phenomenal Woman Book Tag. The first prompt is my favourite woman author. As you would probably almost suspect with me by now, I'm not going to narrow it down to just one. I've decided to choose two. I have two women who moved to the state of Tasmania in Australia. Tasmania is the southernmost state in Australia, just south of Victoria. It's an island all on its own. And the two women that I've chosen to look at are Margaret Scott, who was one of the 10-pound Poms, and she emigrated from Britain, having been born in Bristol, and she moved to Tasmania as a 10-pound Pom, coming out here as an immigrant, and she lived the rest of her adult life in Tasmania. She did lots of interesting things, Margaret Scott. She actually, when she was at Tasmania, she did a PhD on Machiavellian villains in Elizabethan drama, and she was well known in her writing as being a great wit, a real sly, comic, clever person. She did a lot of essays, a lot of extended type journalism, and at the end of her life she became a great favourite on ABC television. There was a satirical sort of week in review type program on current affairs, and she was often included in this panel of people to talk about the week in review in a sort of a comic, sly, satirical way. And she became one of the great favourites of this program. She became quite a TV personality. But she was also a great memoir. I can't say that. She was also a great diary writer. She wrote memoirs. And she did, of course, a lot of poetry, which is why I found her, and I just love her voice. This is one book that she wrote. This is a book called Changing Countries. So this whole book is a meditation on what it was like to grow up in that sort of World War II type Britain, and then to come out to Australia as a migrant and live the rest of her life here in Tasmania. So it's a wonderful meditation on that migrant experience. It's just terrific. It's a lot of fun. And the other person that I'm going to talk about was actually a Queenslander who also moved to Tasmania though, so she spent most of her adult, even though she'd grown up in Brisbane in Queensland, but as a young adult after she got married, the family moved to Hobart in Tasmania, and she lived the rest of her life in Tasmania, and that's the poet Gwen Harwood. Gwen Harwood is probably a poet, probably while she was alive, she probably would have felt a little bit in the shadow of people like Judith Wright, Les Murray. In more contemporary circles, there's someone like Judy Beveridge. She probably always felt that she was a little bit in the shadow of other people. But I think in the last 10 years, her reputation has just continued to grow. And there are a lot of people, I don't like this whole thing of who was the greatest poet. I just think it's meaningless, drivel. But anyway, in terms of other people assessment and valuation of things, a lot of people are now beginning to argue that, in a matter of fact, Gwen Harwood was possibly the greatest of all 20th century Australian poets. So her reputation is really on the rise. And only a couple of years ago, this fantastic, great, monumental biography of Gwen Harwood came out by Anne-Marie Priest. My Tongue is My Own. What a great title for a biography. But this is just a fantastic book. It only came out in 2022, so it's hot off the press. It's a terrific book. I might start by looking a little bit at Margaret Scott. This is a terrific book by Margaret Scott. As I said, looking at that migrant experience. This is a collection of prose pieces, memoir, reminiscences, all sorts of things like that, interspersed with poems. I think I will only read the poems because I'm not going to have time to read a more extended prose piece. But this is a collection of prose and poetry, very cleverly, interweaving from text to text type. The first poem I thought I might read is On the Perimeter. There is a great deal that I do not understand, and since I spend every weekend doing what asks to be done, without asking why, and every week driving too fast to watch the scenery, it seems unlikely that I shall ever move to the centre of any circle, or leave myself alone with silence long enough to let it hold my hand. You can see that really clever, sort of sly intelligence that Margaret Scott is so known for. Here's another beautiful poem called Child of the Time. This is back in Bristol, right at the beginning of Margaret Scott's life. Child of the Time. I was born in 1934, 10 nights before the night of the long knives, and lay in a canopied pram, watching the sunny garden, while Dillinger lay in state with his bullet holes. My mother wheeled me proudly to the shops the German government called tenders for crematoria. My father rose from breakfast, left for business. He was 44 and had always wanted a girl. In London, Moseley rose up, black and marvellous, parading in the eyes of all the hopeless his splendid, positive regiment of biff boys. One black shirt threw a 4-year-old through a window. No charges were preferred. It was summertime, and I was left to kick my little legs. Oh, Moseley, that fascist ugliness, only this time in the British context. I just cannot understand the magnetic appeal of fascism that is so many people, and to see neo-fascism once again on the rise in so many countries. It's heartbreaking. Here's a poem called The Bomb, still back in Bristol during those World War II years. Each morning, just after dawn, when the last of the enemy bombers had droned away, children came out on the streets to hunt for shrapnel. It was all the go. You had to have a collection spread in the back of or the garage, or, if your mother would wear it, on your bedroom floor. Most of the fragments we found were arrowhead size, coppery coloured or seared like a slick in the road with dark rainbow. But some of the grammar school boys had much bigger pieces, things you could recognise, bits of propellers or shells with Messerschmitt engines. My father, who spent all night dodging the stuff as he hurried around getting people down to the shelters, could never say if one of the miserable splinters had once been part of a plane or the fin of a bomb. He'd simply turn it round and round in his fingers, wondering most likely how it would feel to find something like that in his eye or throat or groin. One morning, he took the shutters down, and there by the path I saw, before anyone else had a chance to spot it, a whole, immaculate, unexploded bomb. It was silver, gleaming with exclamatory light. It seemed to lie in an arc of comic book spikes, like a bunter pie. It was mine, given meekly up to the little patch where I knew every pebble and crack, every pimple of moss from years of crouching for marbles and woodlouse races. When I told the boys on the corner, they all said, "Yeah?" Voices rising and breaking in real excitement. My father said I had taken the bomb away, but it was going to have it defused and bring it back. "Yeah," they said, and punted away on their bikes, sniggering and talking about their propeller shafts and the tanks that their fathers had captured in the western desert. As well as having that real sly wit, you can get a sense, can't you, with Margaret Scott? She has a great feeling for the drama in language. Here's another beautiful poem, Birds of Paradise. As I said previously in a previous video, I'm a mad twitcher. I can't resist any bird with references, even no matter how oblique, to a bird. Birds of Paradise. Angles dissolve. The dark piano with the inner eye stares straight at unreadable music, lets all its keys hive off to a flat blossom of light from an unseen lamp. The carpet shy as a bird, a presence without a pattern, and there on the couch by the window, the face seen only in mirrors, long changed, glimmers in noon-night dusk. They're frightened for her eyes. She mustn't read, and under the tin-drawn weave of curtained sun, filtered through 50 years, lies all day long watching the wallpaper birds, perched in their twinning subfusk paradise. She counts their sinuous necks and panicky crests, the long cascading plumes of their fawn tails, their lidless eyes, she thinks, look fierce and cruel. Their beaks are poised to rip at bluish fruits, dangling as long as they live, beyond their reach. The lunchtime tray comes in. She scrabbles at the gravy on her plate and, cradling in one hand some dripping meat, potato, cabbage shreds, climbs up to give the nearest bird a share. She hides a hustle of wings all around the room, feels for the upper bowels, the burning stare of envious outrage, drops back and sees, probably with relief, that paradise streaked with gravies lost in depth, changing to dingy paper on a wall, a pattern without a presence. She sinks again among her shadowy pillows. The echo of all that followed shimmers away. Perhaps it seems the birds, humbled to pictures, took a kinder look about the eyes. All right, now we've moved to Tasmania. This is when she's first arrived as a migrant in Australia. In Tasmania. "It's so like England," said our shipboard friend. "You'll feel quite at home here at the earth's end. A sudden sweep of woodland to the sea flings on the heart some surging memory of Dorset or of Devonshire. But here, above the trees' familiar mass, one spare exotic scarecrow gum clutches the sky. But here above the trees' familiar mass, one spare exotic scarecrow gum clutches the sky, strange as the cold face of a passer-by, turned at being mistaken for a friend. There are no reasons here, only no end of days, with which of time a beating drum, calling some ageless, ruthless brute to come in nightmare from a wilderness of waves and stalk this place of unremembered graves. Oh, Australia has such a terrible legacy of colonial frontier violence against the first Australian people. Shocking. Here's the last poem I thought I might read. This is a wonderful poem called Feast, again set in Tasmania. The smoke of the barbecue drifts up like sand, rising and swaying in a clear pool. The women with cool arms and light clothes, sky blue, white, pink and wattle yellow, move round the table, touching forks and plates, checking the bowls of radishes and lettuce, tomatoes speckled with basil, avocados sliced in a creamy fan. One sets down a basket of brown rolls, another a dish of fruit, oranges, sharp green apples, bananas and nectarines, with cheeks like the petals of lolling crimson roses. The boughs overhead are all ladders and props, with the sheen of young flesh. The sun reaches down to stroke them through latticed wells, through glistening leaves, bunched in the long branches like swarming bees. When the fish are ready, grilled from silver to bronze, some peeling to show the white flakes under the skin, they're piled on a blue plate with lemons and parsley. The men open the wine, ruby and topaz light, dancing every which way. The children come running, chattering over the grass. And everyone sits down in the speckled shade, their hands and laughter weaving a bright net like sun through water. Oh boy. Margaret Scott, the first of my marvellous, phenomenal women authors. Wonderful migrant who wrote of that so richly of that migrant experience, coming as a 10-pound poem from the United Kingdom, from Bristol to Tasmania in Australia. A marvellous poet and memoirist. My goodness, that's a hard word to say. Okay, my second phenomenal woman author, Gwen Harwood. She is a great favourite of mine. Gwen Harwood is an interesting one, actually. It's really hard growing up in Australia because we often feel very neglected by the rest of the world. Gwen Harwood is probably not known overseas at all, and she should be. Her poetry is really rich, particularly with references to European writers, European painters. She's done a series of poems, for example, on that gorgeous Italian painter, Giorgio Morandi. She's done lots of work reimagining Rilke into English. She's done a lot of work on the philosophy of Wittgenstein and reimagining Wittgenstein's voice and ideas, again, into her own poetic language. She does a lot of work. She was actually a classically trained pianist, and at one stage, as a very young person, dreamed of being a concert pianist, but it didn't quite work out for her. But she wrote lots of poems about music, particularly classical music, Bach, Beethoven, all the great piano music. So this really is a poetry that could have been easily written by a European. The other interesting thing about Gwen Harwood, like Margaret Scott, she had a great sense of dramatic language and a really sly comic wit. She loved to write with masks on, so she had many pseudonyms, some male pseudonyms, some women's pseudonyms. She was always exploring, teasing, causing fuss, causing problems, in a mischievous, good-natured sort of way. A really interesting voice, never took anything too seriously, even though the poetry is very rich with allusion and as I said, a lot of allusion to European culture, European history. A very, very rich poet. As I said, like Margaret Scott, she grew up in Brisbane, in Queensland, and then moved to Tasmania, and then lived the rest of her adult life in Hobart. So it's a very rich poetry. Here's one poem called In Hospital. Morning, I dare not stir, for what may wake, for what pain may wake. My daughter yesterday, unwillingly for my sake, brought here, carried with her, this jar full of odd things, stones, shells, glass, scavenges from our last holiday. Sea toys, child's jewels, rolled to smooth anonymous shapes. She filled the jar with water to bring a gleaming back from their chilled and speechless world. They hold salt air, soft stone, clear light, and a swallow's ragged flight, wings closed, continuing in air between wave and wave. Arrogant on that shore, I raced with my child. Pain splinters me. I am cracked like glass. I taste salt. My own fear can save nothing, am ground degraded on my fragments, abraded, featureless, and am free of pain for a brief space. A fire-talented tongue will choose its truth. I do not bear what's gone, do not refuse what's yet to come. The grace of water rinsed, remade these stones. My tongue's betrayed by pain. They speak my prayer. She had a wonderful way, a little bit like what I was talking about in my last video with William Stafford. She had a wonderful way, but a very very quietly, with a lot of dignity, walking a poem through the language of philosophy. For Gwen Harwood, it was largely Wittgenstein that really excited her, but she had a wonderful way of doing this. Here's another beautiful poem called The Glass Jar, and it's dedicated to another wonderful Tasmanian poet called Vivian Smith. Vivian Smith grew up in Tasmania, but he lived most of his adult life in Sydney. He was a reader in English for his whole working career at Sydney University. Wonderful, generous, kind, quiet man. So here is the poem, The Glass Jar, dedicated to Vivian Smith. The child one summer's evening soaked a glass jar in the reeling sun, hoping to keep when the day was done, and all the sun's disciples cloaked in dream and darkness from his passion fled, this host, this pulse of light beside his bed. Wrapped in a scarf, his monstrance stood, ready to bless, to exorcise monsters that, whispering, would rise nightly from the intricate wood that ringed his bed, to light with total power the holy commonplace of field and flower. He slept, his sidelong violence summoned friends whose mosaic vision saw his heart entire. Pincer and claw, trident and vampire fang, envenomed with his most secret hate, reached and came near to pierce him in the thicket of his fear. He woke, recalled the jar of light, and trembling reached one hand to grope the mantling scarf away. Then hope fell headlong from its eagle height. Through the dark house he ran, sobbing his loss, to the last clearing that he dared not cross. The bedroom where his comforter lay in his rival's fast embrace, and faithless would not turn her face from the gross violence done to her. Love's proud exultance played with a score no child could realise. Once more to bed and to worse dreams he went. A ring of skeletons compelled his steps with theirs. His father held fiddle and bow and scraped a scent to the malignant ballet. The child dreamed this dance perpetual, and waking screamed fresh morning to his windowsill as ravening birds began their song, the resurrected sun, whose long triumph through flower-brushed fields would feel night's gulfs and hungers, come to wink and laugh in a glass jar beside a crumpled scarf. Oh boy, I remember when I first read this poem. This is a poem that is reflecting on the cost to women of suburban housewifery. I guess it's, it's a poem in many ways in response to that sort of first wave of feminism. In the park. She sits in the park. Her clothes are out of date. Two children whine and bicker, tug her skirt. A third draws aimless patterns in the dirt. Someone she loved once passes by, too late to feign indifference to that casual nod. How nice, etc. Time holds great surprises. From his neat head unquestionably rises a small balloon, but for the grace of God. They stand a while in flickering light, rehearsing the children's names and birthdays. It's so sweet to hear their chatter, watch them grow and thrive. She says to his departing smile, then nursing the youngest child, sits staring at his feet. To the wind she says, they have eaten me alive. Whew, what a last line. My goodness. Oh, I suppose, in that early 1960s, 1970s Australia, the courage to even write a poem like that and publish it. I guess she probably copped a little bit of censorship for a poem like that, or, that censoring negative attitude. Here's another very powerful poem called Bone Scan, which was the title of one of her later collection of poems. And it starts with a psalm, a verse from Psalm. Thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my down-sitting and mine uprising. Bone Scan. In the twinkling of an eye, in a moment all is changed. On a small radiant screen, honey-dew, melon green, are my scintillating bones. Still in my flesh I see the God who goes with me, glowing with radioactive isotopes. This is what he at last allows a mortal eye to behold. The grand supporting frame, complete, but for the wisdom teeth. The friend who lives beneath appearances, alive with light. Each glittering bone assures me, you are known. Oh, it's a fantastic poem, isn't it? And again, that stunning last line. Whoa. I might finish Gwen Harwood with this poem. Morning again. Morning again, though not yet light. The next door bantams call me up in a strange world where dream and waking melt in a featureless expanse. Some tide of violence has been close. No relics mark that endless pain, but someone's buried, some new ghost, between one cockcrow and the next, is fretting. Now a figure rises so distant, one can only tell from its stretched arms it might be human, and close behind another presence, not human, marks its stumbling flight, cloudy enough to blur the line of any possible horizon, yet like enough to all I fear. For me to know I am the human figure with aching arms extended, casting no shadow, reaching out for substance in my flight from terror. Safety, calm light on leaf and feather. Here is the news, and now the weather. An ordinary human shadow attends me as I fill the kettle. Oh, that lovely return to the domestic. Gwen Harwood, just a marvellous voice. I suppose one of her biggest influences, I guess, would have been that English poet Philip Larkin and that sort of school of poetry that developed in that sort of mid-20th century English milieu, I guess. She actually has written a series of poems in memory of Philip Larkin after he passed away as well. So she, I think, was quite influenced by that sort of poetry. A marvellous poet, marvellous. You can see she wrote quite a bit. She was very committed to that poetic craft her whole adult life. A marvellous poet. And I was so excited a couple of years ago, as I said, when this big biography of Gwen Harwood finally came out. It's the first biography of Gwen Harwood that's ever been published by Anne-Marie Priest. And it's a marvellous book, so well written, meticulously researched. It really recovers, Gwen Harwood had a way in public of looking very prim and proper, you know, the archetypal domestic housewife, that suburban housewife. But she actually had a real sly, mischievous side to her, and a very different side. And this biography really explores these other personas, these other masks that Gwen Harwood lived her life by. It's a very, very interesting biography. Maybe it was written now because, you know, Gwen Harwood passed away 10 or 15 years ago, and maybe it was time now, you know, with the passing of her and her partner and that sort of thing, maybe people thought it was time for this biography to finally come out. It's a beautiful biography, absolutely beautiful. All right, back to the second prompt. My favourite woman character. Wow, my favourite woman character. It's hard to go past Shakespeare, isn't it? You know, when you think of female characters, your mind straight away goes, I suppose, to the Three Witches and to Lady Macbeth in the wonderful Scottish play. But if I can't choose Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth and the Three Witches, I think I would have to go to Virginia Woolf. I just love Virginia Woolf, and I think out of her great body of work, probably the two characters that most stand out in my memory would be Mrs. Dalloway and, of course, Orlando, that classic shapeshifter. Even though, for me, probably my favourite Virginia Woolf is probably To the Lighthouse. I think as a novel, this is almost the perfect... Oh, and The Waves. They're probably my favourite Virginia Woolf novels. But I do love Mrs. Dalloway, and the character is just so beautiful. The other thing that I love so much about Mrs. Dalloway, of course, is the Michael Cunningham novel, The Hours, this postmodernist, joyful bliss. The way he weaved in and out of the life of Virginia Woolf with resurrecting out of literature Mrs. Dalloway and bringing her to life in, you know, 20th century New York, and then going to the reader, that 1960s reader of Virginia Woolf. I just love the way he weaved in and out of all these narratives. This book, The Hours, it's just, for me, it's almost I don't read a lot of postmodernist literature. I'm not very drawn to it. But this book is just beautiful. It's so beautifully written and so tender and heartbreaking, heart-wrenching with the way it deals with that struggle about death and depression and, of course, suicide. It's a very powerful experience. And I also really love the film that was made by Stephen Daldry, Philip Glass and David Hare, that wonderful film that was made of this novel. So that, for me, this really brings Mrs. Dalloway to life for me. I just find that character magnetic. And this is my copy of Orlando. It's a lovely Penguin hardback edition. Not actually great for opening up. It's actually very difficult to read. I would actually much prefer these in the paperbacks. They're much easier to read and keep things moving along nicely. But yes, my favourite female characters. I think I would go with Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and Orlando, that great shapeshifter. All right, if I was creating a book prize, which phenomenal woman author would I choose? Well, for me, it would have to be Olga Masters. Olga Masters is a wonderful Australian prose writer. She wrote journalism, short stories, and novels. I think she always wanted to be a writer. She always felt that calling, that vocation to the creative written arts. But she got married very young, as people in that generation, she grew up before World War II, so, came out of that terrible interwar period of the Great Depression leading into World War II. So she got married very young. She had 7 children, so it was child after child. Her husband was a teacher, so they didn't have a huge amount of money to spread around. So she didn't really take up writing until she turned 58. Right at the end of her life, she had 9 years before she died from a brain tumour. She had 9 years where her children had all grown up and were giving her a little more time for herself, a little more independence. And, her adult kids, when interviewed about Mum, have always said, growing up, they knew she was a wonderful mum, wonderful loving mum, but she was also full of turmoil, full of frustration, and they all knew that there was something about their mum that was unresolved, something that was unfulfilled, and they wanted something. She wanted something else, and I think clearly what it always was that space and time to explore her writing. When she started to do the writing, she was often asked, do you regret your children, getting married so young, giving your whole life away in the service of others? And Olga Masters always said, my children are my greatest books. Oh, can you imagine what it must have been like to be one of those 7 kids and hearing that? My children are my greatest books. Wow. But I am so pleased that at the end of her life, from the age of 58, finally, Olga Masters did have that space and time, and her children all chipped in and bought her first electric typewriter so she could crack on. So finally, a few years ago, this wonderful biography came out on Olga Masters by Julie Lewis, by the University of Queensland Publishing. Here's a lovely little piece. This is a tiny little tidbit that Olga Masters wrote and is quoted in this biography. Olga Masters, A Lot of Living. It's quoted in this by Julie Lewis. This is a beautiful little tidbit that Olga Masters wrote at the end of her life. Really beautiful, dramatic, sly, comic wit. It's titled, Things I'd Love to Do Before I Die. I would need to be hasty about it, as if I twitch if I'm away from the typewriter for more than 20 consecutive minutes. I began writing at 58. That was 7 years ago. I have many nightmares about the time I have left, whether there is enough of it to write it all down, all the things that I want to. It's quite tantalizing. A character comes up in a chapter of my current work, and I dream for a short while, a very short while, of weaving a whole book around him or her. That would be the book after the book after the book that I'm doing. I see myself sans teeth, hearing, sight, dragging an arthritic body to a word processor, the ear-piercing sound of my knuckles cracking with the effort of finding the joints of my fingers. Oh boy, such a lovely, dramatic, sly, comic wit. But yes, I'm so pleased that at the end of her life, she did get that space and time to find her creative self. This is a wonderful book, edited by Deidre Coleman, and this is a book called Reporting Home. This is a small book that's just collected together some of Olga Masters' pieces in journalism. This is the first proper book that Olga Masters ever wrote. This is a collection of short stories called The Home Girls. Olga Masters, right through that last 9-year period, she did write a lot of short stories, and she saw those as a large part of her apprenticeship, I suppose. Before she went to the novels, she started writing short stories to complement all the journalism that she was doing. And she always talked about that as her apprenticeship to finding her own voice. This is a wonderful collection. I was really lucky in Australia. These publishing house, Text Classics, they went back to the backlog of particular writers who had been long out of print and returned them, getting them back into publication so that people could buy them. I was really pleased when Text did a couple of books for Olga Masters, books that had been long out of print. So the first one they did was this one, this collection of short stories, The Home Girls, and then they did one of her later novels, Amy's Children. Olga Masters, she grew up in regional New South Wales. She spent all of her childhood and young adulthood in small country towns in New South Wales, usually down in the southern coast of New South Wales. And then when she got married and started having these 7 children, nearly all of her young and middle years as an adult, as the kids were being born and growing up, that was also in a series of small country towns in New South Wales, as her husband moved from school to school and slowly worked his way up the ladder to being a principal. So she spent a lot of time in small regional towns in New South Wales. So unsurprisingly, when she started writing these novels, most of the novels are set in the Depression, World War II type years, and they're set in small country towns in New South Wales. And they're really dealing with patriarchy, with the damage done to women by putting them down, by trying to keep them in their place. It's a wonderful novel, a wonderful world, really exploring gender, the representation of gender, the damage that is done to women by patriarchy. But there also, there is a lot of sadness in the novels. She wrote one novel, for example, called A Long Time Dying, even though it's actually a book about life and about living to long, old life. But her books deal with the Depression, the shock, the horror of the Depression, the hardship, and particularly the hardship that was done to women in these very tight, very fraught domestic spaces, with child being born, child after child after child, being born into real poverty with very little safety net of a government to intervene to help out. They're novels that can be a little bit hard to read. Some of them can come across at times of being very much about hardship and difficulties. But they're very beautiful. She has a very simple, very beautiful writing style. She really evokes these small country towns, these small families doing it tough, doing their best to somehow get through and make ends meet. So here's another book, Loving Daughters. Here's another one. Oh, that's one I just talked about, A Long Time Dying. And then after Olga Masters died from a brain tumour, this book came out. This was a collection of short stories that she wrote in that 9-year period after she had begun publications and had started to get a bit of a name for herself. So this was a posthumous collection of short stories. So right at the end of her life, in that 9-year period, she was able to get these 2 collections of short stories and 3 or 4 really gems of novels. I love reading them. She's a beautiful writer, and I think someone like Olga Masters, she deserves a bigger readership. She deserves to be known and really remembered. Her children, oh my goodness. You can't live in Australia and be too far from one of the Masters. The Masters really all moved into journalism, the creative arts, film direction, current affairs shows, all sorts of things. They really dominate all of those sorts of areas in Australian publishing, broadcasting, across many mediums. So they're a family of unbelievable high achievers. And I just love hearing the adult kids now talk about mum and about what mum meant to them. Olga Masters was definitely, like Gwen Harwood, like Margaret Scott, she was a phenomenal woman who deserves to be remembered and have her books in publication, able to be bought. So if I was able to give a prize to someone, it would certainly be to Olga Masters, and to keep her work published, relevant, going out the shop windows. tag some other women phenomenal booktubers. Well, I thought I might tag, I don't think any of these people have done this tag, so I might tag Emily from the Linguist's Library, Eleanor from The Only Real Property. Eleanor's channel is a new channel that I've only just discovered. It's a channel that really gets into the details, the inner makings of poetry. Eleanor's channel has been a great discovery for me. She's introduced me to so much contemporary American poetry, conceptual poetry, and things that I haven't read much of or been really exposed to. So I am learning so much from Eleanor's channel. If you want a really good channel, Eleanor's channel, The Only Real Property. It's a gem. And then, of course, I've recently also just discovered Hannah from Hannah's Books. And Hannah was one of these people involved in Framed in September, and I write a lot of ekphrastic poetry, so I'm really excited that I've discovered Hannah's channel, and I'm really excited to be taking part with her in Framed in September. I can't wait to see what happens with all this ekphrastic stuff. And then, of course, two channels that I've been following now for quite a while and I just love. Meg from Books Off the Beaten Path and Kerry from Bookish Adventures in Wellbeing. So there are 5 women phenomenal booktubers who I might tag if they would like to take part in this terrific tag, this wonderful tag, the Phenomenal Woman's Book Tag, created by the marvellous Marilyn Maya Mendoza, a fantastic channel who, again, I really recommend you follow. And I was tagged to take part in this by the wonderful and generous Pat from Book Chat with Pat. So I really enjoyed taking part in this. Really glad that as a male I was invited to take part in this celebration of some phenomenal women authors. Gwen Harwood, Margaret Scott and Olga Masters. I hope you track them down and make them part of your daily readerly routines. Thank you and bye for now.